if Copenhagen is correct, we all survive. And the reason we survive is we are the observers of our own universes. That our universe comes into existence because effectively we are observing it. And one of the points I'd like to make now, and it's something I make in talks quite regularly, every single person in this room, there's one thing that you've observed in your life. You've survived, haven't you? You know other people that have died, but you're still here. You survive and continue to observe. And if anybody's interested then in my model, I argue that I can prove scientifically that we never die and that we continue and we survive. I call it cheating the ferryman. And I'm applying a lot of this physics to the fact of potential human immortality. And what is then weirder is that John Wheeler, who was a very famous quantum physicist, argued that you can prove that not only does your act of observation bring in this universe into existence, but it also brings in the universe in the past into existence. Now, bear with me on this one. What I'm going to argue and what I'm going to apply is Wheeler's interpretation of the twin slit experiment. I hope I've got it here. Yeah, there you go. What Wheeler said was, imagine that you could create the light, take the light coming from a quasar. Now, quasars, quasi-stellar objects, are huge sources of energy in the universe, but they only existed for the first few billion years of the universe. So when we see quasars now, we're seeing the light as it was billions of years ago. They're no longer there, they no longer exist. But their light is still getting to us. And he said, imagine doing the twin slit experiment, where the light came from the quasar. And what happens is there's something called gravitational lensing. When light goes round a mass object, like a galaxy, it gets bent. So what will happen is the light from the star here, the quasar here, will bend round a galaxy. So what you'll end up with is seeing something called an Einstein cross, where you'll see the light as if there's a cross and there's 4 stars, but in fact there's only one, but it's the same light source. And he said, imagine if you could place out in space the same kind of idea of the twin slit experiment, and the light from those 2 sources goes through one slit or the other. Wheeler argued that at the act of observation of the person seeing the experiment brings into existence the quasar that hasn't existed for billions of years. Now that's extraordinary. Now the reason this makes sense is because there's one thing I haven't brought into in the whole argument so far: time. Time is the most peculiar thing you can imagine. St. Augustine, when he was asked whether he understood what time was, said, I think I understand it if I don't think about it. But the moment I start thinking about time, I realize I don't really know what it is at all. And this is profoundly important, because rather like I said that you cannot identify the color red to somebody else because you can't describe red only by saying, well, it's a little bit like orange. But you can't objectively prove to anybody else that the red you see is the red that somebody else is seeing, because you can't. The same goes for time. If you turn around and say, oh, I just perceived 10 minutes go past. But is your 10 minutes the same as somebody else's 10 minutes? Because you only can ever measure time by looking at a watch, which of course isn't actually measuring time, it's measuring geometry because it's moving around. So time is only ever measured by itself. You know, you can have a minute of a minute or an hour of an hour, but you can never, ever turn around and measure that objectively. I mean, for instance, have any of you ever been involved in a car crash or been given bad news where time suddenly goes and you feel it traveling slowly and slower? How can that be? Because is your time different to somebody else's? I know people that have been involved in car crashes where they've had sufficient time to negotiate their way round the car crash. The reason is because their processing of time slows down to such an extent they can escape a car crash. So what is taking place there? So suddenly when we're talking about time and billions of years ago, we don't really know what that means. Time effectively is, as the scientists will say, is something called entropy. It's the idea of something going from order to disorder. As the universe expands, things get more disordered. But that's not to do with the observer as such. Somebody having fun over there. People always do that, don't they? They always phone you at the wrong moment. So if you then bring Tegmark's idea, that means that the universe needs an observer to come into existence, doesn't it? It means if these quasars come into existence by the act of observation, suddenly there's a relationship between what we are as observers and what is out there. So suddenly the role of consciousness becomes profoundly important. But it then gets stranger, because there's something else that's been discovered in recent years that is beyond comprehension, that the vast majority of people do not know about. It's called superposition or entanglement. And what they found is, well, we'll go back to Einstein. Einstein had profound problems with the Copenhagen interpretation. One of the things he suggested was a thought experiment in 1937, which was called the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment. And in this, he argued that if you sent two subatomic particles off in different directions, and nobody was observing them, and you did something with one particle, what would happen to the other one if you entangled them? Because what happens is if you put two particles into the same quantum state, and I can't go into detail what a quantum state is, but they're similar. You put them into different directions in space and in time. Effectively, if you do something with one, it affects the other one. Now, what happened was they reproduced this experiment in 1980. The guys called Alain Aspect and Dalibard in Paris. And what they did was they took two particles, entangled them, spread them in different locations, and they found if they did something to one particle, the other one reacted instantaneously. In other words, there was no time lapse for the message to go. It was faster than the speed of light. And they came to this incredible conclusion that once particles they have the same state, they can communicate with each other instantaneously when they're close together. Let's think about this for a second. 13.4 billion years ago, there was the Big Bang. Before the Big Bang, every single particle in this universe, every single particle in your body was part of a point state. The whole universe was in a point state, which means that every single particle in this universe is entangled anyway, which means that the particles can communicate instantaneously. Now, again, you might turn around and say, okay, but what's the practical solutions for that? Well, there's a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna, who's been doing a series of experiments where they've been entangling particles and placing them at different distances. And they're getting hundreds of miles difference, and these particles still communicate instantaneously. It seems that at a deeper level of reality, everything is related. So let's recap what I'm saying here now. So suddenly physical reality that you believe is physical reality is 99.99 whatever empty space. What those particles are actually made of is nothing. They are point particles. That everything you think you are seeing that is being created by your brain is literally creating an internal model of external reality. That particles can be entangled. That cats can be alive and dead at the same time. And all these things are modern science. So where are we now? Well, we'll have the Niels Bohr idea, the Copenhagen interpretation, that the universe needs an act of observation to come into existence. That's option one. Option two, Hugh Everett, the many worlds interpretation, that the universe splits at the every act of observation. You then have a guy called David Bohm, and this gets very interesting because David Bohm was an American physicist who fell foul of the McCarthy witch hunts in the 1950s. And he ended up moving down, I think, to Argentina and then ended up in London. And he said, neither of these things are right. He said there's another better alternative, that a deeper level of reality, there's a different reality at a deeper level. And it's interesting what he argued, and again, follow me on this. The smallest possible size we can imagine scientifically is called the Planck scale, or the Planck square, which is really tiny. But the smallest thing we can actually observe using our machines in terms of size is something like 20 or 30 times bigger than that. So in terms of size, there's this huge area of reality that we cannot measure and don't even know what's taking place there. And he argued that really what the universe is a hollow movement. It's like a hologram. And the universe is made up of information, data. And he argued that everything we perceive is something coming out of this information field. And he called it the implicate and explicate orders. And the explicate order is what we perceive. And everything we perceive is being generated literally by numbers, by mathematics. So the universe is mathematical in its structure. There is no physical reality, it is just maths. Which means that the universe effectively is like a bloody big hologram. And then Karl Pribram, who was at Georgetown University, came up with a similar conclusion about consciousness. He argued that consciousness works holographically. So if he's right, that means a hologram is being processed by a hologram. So suddenly we've got this sort of thing creating itself almost. Now, the reason they believe that consciousness is a hologram is because of one of the greatest mysteries of consciousness, which is something I'll be talking about in my other talks. And it's this, it's called the binding problem. All of you at the moment are having a feeling of simultaneity. You feel that, say, for instance, you see a red ball bouncing down a street. You see a red ball moving down, but different parts of the brain are processing what you're seeing in different parts. So the red is being processed in your visual cortex, the movement is being processed in another part of the brain, and everything else you're seeing around is being processed in different parts of the brain. Now, communication in the brain through neurons it's not like the speed of light. It's much slower. But we get a feeling that everything is happening now. They don't understand how the brain does that. And if ever you want to embarrass somebody who's a materialist reductionist, just say the binding problem. How do you explain that? Because they can't. So it means that the brain must be functioning in a completely different way to the way we think it ordinarily functions. And again, one of the things that I've recently found from my friends who are doing leading edge research in brain analysis and working with dimethyltryptamine and working with psilocybin and other mind-altering substances is something extraordinary. And it's something that only happened comparatively recently. The University of Sussex in the UK, they rigged people up and gave them magic mushrooms, psilocybin. And they had an fMRI scanner of the brain, so they knew exactly what the brain was doing exactly every second. They gave them psilocybin, and they were expecting to discover that the brain started to link. In other words, to create the hallucinations, the bits of the brain would start lighting up that didn't normally light up. That's not what they found. In fact, the opposite happened. Parts of the brain switched off. The brain wasn't it was literally, the psilocybin was stopping the brain cutting out information. In other words, when we think that our brain is giving us all the information that's around us, it's doing the opposite. It's taking information out, and it's taking information out for one very good reason. Because if you were sitting there now and all the information your brain is receiving from how your fingers are hurting, you've got an itch somewhere, you're hearing voices outside, you have to attend to what's in front of you, like listening to me, hopefully. So the issue there is that the brain takes things out. Now, if the brain takes things out, what is it taking out usually when we're in everyday consciousness? And I have a concept in my books that I call the Huxleyan spectrum. And what I argue is, depending upon where you are on the Huxleyan spectrum is how you perceive reality. Now, I would argue, for instance, is there anybody in the room who's a classical migrainer? Okay. Do you get scotomas? Do you get breakdown of your visual field kind of thing? That's because the brain is functioning in a different way. I'm a classical migrainer. I get profound deja vu sensations when I actually have that. Then if you move along from there and you get to the higher levels of migraine, you move over into something called temporal lobe epilepsy. And people who have temporal lobe epileptics perceive the world in quite a different way when they're actually in their aura state. They see things we don't normally see. Then you take it further and you get schizophrenia, where the doors of perception are wide open. So what it means is the brain is acting as an attenuator, but these unusual neurological circumstances seem to open the doors and make it wider. So coming back full circle, so when we were saying about how little of reality do we actually perceive, suddenly it's all brain generated. And when your brains function in certain ways is how broad this is going to be. I mean, I'll give an example of this. If anybody goes onto my YouTube site, my YouTube channel, there's a young lady I interviewed live on my show about 2 years ago called Rebecca Sharrock. And she's autistic. And she's only one of 8 human beings, I think, in history that has what's called superior autobiographical memory. She remembers absolutely everything that has ever happened to her, including her dreams, including being in the womb. And I tested her live. I didn't tell her I was going to do this. My assistant's daughter loves Harry Potter, as does Rebecca. So I said to Rebecca, so you remember everything in your life? She said, yes. And I turned around to my assistant, Sarah, and I said, okay, Sarah, can you take out all the books that your daughter has, the Harry Potter books? Can you pick one at random? Which she did. And then I said, can you pick a page at random from that book? And then can you open that page and can you pick a paragraph at random? And can you read what it says? And I told Rebecca, can you tell me what comes next? She got 3 or 4 words in, and Rebecca gave the whole paragraph, word for word. Now that technically is impossible, unless the human brain is far more extensive than we can possibly believe, but we are ordinarily denied it because the brain acts as an attenuator. So suddenly the reality we believe is out there and the reality we believe is in there is suddenly quite different. So when you have extraordinary experiences, when you see UFOs, when you have encounters with aliens, again, I've got 5 minutes here and I'll mention this as well. There are people I know that are doing research in London at the moment on dimethyltryptamine. And they're testing encounters with aliens, with entities, with McKenna's machine elves. And one of my associates told me that he was under experimental conditions. He took DMT intravenously and he shot off into what was called a DMT cage. And he's in this place and this entity appears in front of him and it prods him and goes, you shouldn't be doing it this way. This is not the way it should be done. And it backed away into the mists. And he found himself coming too. And he thought, that's really weird. The entity is telling me something that I do want to do. 2 weeks later, he's back in the laboratory, goes in the injection, goes into the DMT zone. The same creature comes over again and says, I told you last time, this is not the way you should be doing it. Now, the question is here, was that entity just a figment of his imagination? Or was it something that had identity and consciousness that was different to his, that he was encountering under these circumstances? And again, this is something I'll be talking about in my other talks over the weekend. So there's a number of things I'll be doing. So in the next few days, I'll be doing a whole thing on time. So I'll be giving all the background information to time that I've been talking about. I'll also be doing a course on alien encounters, which I extrapolated from the one I did here last year. And also on Monday, I'll be doing a 3-hour intensive on the American Californian science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. Because I argue that Philip K. Dick actually manifested many of the things I discuss here. And I wrote a biography of Philip K. Dick a few years ago. And believe me, there are going to be things I'm going to be presenting in that will blow your mind. as there will be in my one on time. I'll be giving you absolute 100% evidence of precognition that cannot be denied. And the question is, how then do we see the future? So is time filled in with this? So suddenly reality doesn't seem to be what it is. Time doesn't seem to be what it is. Consciousness doesn't seem to be what it is. We are tripping on the end of a huge change in science. We are tripping now on a change in the paradigm of science. And we are lucky enough to be alive to be witnessing these changes. And the things that you have experienced are the things that stimulate people like me to do more research into this. So I thank you for sharing your experiences. And I know a number of you already shared your experiences with me, and I'm keen to know more. Because believe me, you have to listen to people's experiences. Thank you.